It's my pleasure to be here to explore with you these questions around the transformation of education in rather constraining times, I'm going to argue as well. And what will be interesting, because we have such an international set of delegates, which is fabulous, interdisciplinary perspectives coming from a range of different contexts, to try to make connections across the different speeches this morning with your own context and your own concerns. And I do hope that what I speak about this morning will have resonances, although I'm sure that there will also be lots of differences, because I will be drawing on data that has been collected in the specific context of London institutions. I'll just say a little bit more about myself. Thank you, Sue, very much for your lovely introduction. As Sue said, I'm a sociologist of gender and education. So my talk this morning is very much going to be drawing on sociological perspectives, but critical sociological perspectives, drawing from feminism and from also from Paulo Freire's work. And I am the director of the Paulo Freire Institute-UK. Paulo Freire has had an enormous influence on my thinking, and I'm very keen for us to think about the resonances of Paulo Freire's work for us now in contemporary context, to think and engage questions of transformations in education. Just to position myself and to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, because I do think it's very important that we map through the ways in which we come to particular research questions and particular kinds of research. And I'm very compelled by Jane Miller's notion of the autobiography of the question, in which she talks about the importance of mapping ourselves onto the questions and the histories in which we're exploring through our research. And I came to this area because I was an Access student myself. I accessed higher education as a mature student, completely serendipitously. I had just come through a very traumatic life event. I was rebuilding my life. I had a small son, a stepson, and a new son coming on the way, and I was remarried. And I discovered access to higher education, and it was an incredibly transformative experience for me. I had no kind of big aspirations, but I became compelled by the language of sociology, because it gave me a language to speak from about not only the social injustices that I myself had experienced, but also those that I observed other people's experiencing, and feeling very passionately about these issues, but not necessarily having the language to articulate why and how and what were the kinds of strategies for us to move forward through those kinds of challenges. And I went on to do my degree in sociology, and I met many wonderful and inspirational students along the way, and became very passionate, particularly around women's access to higher education. Went on to do my PhD through just the encouragement of mentors along the way. And I think it's very important that we do encourage those who are coming through different kinds of routes and pathways, because often that can make such a huge difference to a sense of being valued and being recognized as somebody who has potential. And that's really what at the heart of what I'm going to talk about today. The processes by which we might be recognized or not be recognized as having potential are central to processes of accessing higher education. And access to higher education in the UK context is a major policy agenda. Millions and millions of pounds over the past decade and a half have been invested in this widening participation policy framework. However, after all of that investment, some of the same kinds of patterns of exclusion continue to perpetuate, raising significant challenges for policymakers and practitioners. And one of the important, I think, limitations of the policy agenda has been its focus on access to higher education, so a gaze outside of the university, rather than to think about the different cultures and practices within higher education institutions which are complicit in the reproduction of social inequalities within the university. And that's what I want to focus on today. So I'm going to explore, as Sue said, possibilities for developing transformative pedagogies in higher education. What I mean by transformative pedagogies is that we should move beyond concerns with just teaching and learning styles or methods, and to think about the ways that certain forms of knowledge and identity are often privileged in higher education whilst others are marginalized. And as I said, I'm going to draw on the seminal work of Paulo Freire to think about how we might develop dialogical, ethical, reflexive approaches to education by creating opportunities to reshape knowledge in collaboration with those whose experiences have often been socially, culturally, and historically excluded. And in imagining these possibilities, we need also, of course, to think about where we're situated at the moment, the kinds of constraints that face us, and that are posed by the increasing dominance of neoliberalism, and also of the marketization of higher education. And of course, the way that that plays out will be different in terms of different national, institutional, and local contexts. So higher education is increasingly driven by the logic and assumptions of globalization, which have reshaped pedagogies in relation to the imperatives of neoliberalism. And within this context, discourses of so-called teaching excellence, or excellence as a discourse, have become almost taken for granted, and are couched very much in the language of the market, with a preoccupation largely on consumerist orientations to student experience and student engagement, and also the growing significance of league tables. And the notion of diversity has been embraced largely, but often as a marketing tool, without problematizing the ways that diversity is always intertwined with questions of difference, social and cultural inequalities, and the notion, I'm going to talk about more, of misrecognition. Difference tends to be reduced to the marketing images of happy university students from other kinds of backgrounds, but diversity is often constructed as unproblematic and desirable, whilst difference is often seen as needing to be controlled or regulated through various different processes such as standardization and quality assurance. And teaching in higher education itself is often reduced to utilitarian concerns, such as how to deliver a course, what teaching styles to use, or how we might respond flexibly to student as consumer demands. Higher education policy emphasizes the imperative to develop human capital, create competitive knowledge economies, and to develop employable individuals. Market mechanisms, such as league tables, are then used to, in Rajni Naidu's words, exert pressure on universities to comply with consumer demand. Pedagogies are reduced to the language of the market, as I've said, including notions of delivery, style, efficiency, and to notions of consumer demand and satisfaction in what becomes an educational package, so-called delivered by universities who are competing in the so-called business of higher education. And the frameworks of neoliberalism and marketization raise then significant challenges for developing transformative and inclusive pedagogies in higher education. Indeed, as I've already suggested, discourses of diversity tend to conceal the deeper level inequalities that circulate in relation to difference, belonging, and to misrecognition. I'll show that these are insidious inequalities as they are deeply embedded and yet made invisible through the dominant discourses of teaching and learning in the neoliberal university. Neoliberalism intersects, of course, with meritocracy to shape policy agendas to widen participation to diverse groups of students. Meritocracy is often expressed through the principle that higher education should be available to all who have the potential to benefit from university study, regardless of their social background. However, the concept of potential carries multiple and contested meanings. And in my research with Jackie McManus, called Art for a Few, which was on admissions practices to art and design in English universities, we looked at this notion of potential, and we found that it's intricately tied in with subjective constructions. For example, the ways in which a person might be constructed as having aspiration or not, or having motivation or not, or having potential. And in order to be recognized as having potential, the candidate must know first how to present and perform particular kinds of potential. And we found, for example, in art and design, this might include knowing where to shop, knowing where to travel, knowing which museums and galleries you should go to, which artists and designers you should be inspired by, and what forms of art and design you should be interested in. And above that, the performance of attributes such as being witty, dressing with style, and being motivated were all part of the processes in which a person could be recognized as having potential. And although meritocratic assumptions have been extensively critiqued by researchers in the field for ignoring the complexity of the relationship between social, cultural, and economic inequalities and life chances, it still remains central in both policy and practice. So we need to think very carefully about how meritocratic assumptions tend to construct the problem of difference as being related to individual deficit, in which the so-called disadvantaged person is seen to suffer from impoverished levels of aspiration, confidence, or motivation. And within such perspectives, the student that's associated with otherness is often derisively constructed as lacking determination, discipline, or the passion to learn. And in this way, the intersection of neoliberalism with meritocracy subjects those associated with disadvantage, diversity, and difference to processes of self-correction. So I want to now pause for a moment and think about how we might reconceptualize pedagogies, moving away from such utilitarian, individualist, and neoliberal discourses of teaching and learning. We need a framework that acknowledges that through our pedagogical encounters, we form and we reform our identities. That is, we don't simply just bring our identities to pedagogical spaces, but it is through engagements with pedagogical spaces that we make and we become particular kinds of persons. It is through pedagogies that we not only engage with processes of learning, but also with processes of becoming. So we need to consider how the emotional shapes such processes, the ways that the emotional works on and marks out different bodies. Sarah Ahmed argues that emotions, quote, produce the very surfaces and boundaries that allow the individual and the social to be delineated as if they are objects. So in this way, pedagogies do not simply reflect social differences, but pedagogies themselves are classed, gendered, racialized, and tied up with historical ways of being a teacher or being a student in higher education spaces. And these histories are connected to what Foucault calls dividing practices. For example, they tend to privilege the rational over the emotional, marking out difference in relation to characteristics associated with feminine bodies. For example, being seen as too soft or too emotional. Pedagogical relations are thus deeply implicated in the politics of identity making and profoundly connected to the impact of the emotional on the body and on the self, creating sensibilities of belonging or not belonging. And I found Nancy Fraser's work on social justice very useful for thinking through these kinds of concerns, looking at the insidious level of inequalities in higher education. And she explains that to be misrecognized is to be constituted by what she calls institutionalized patterns of cultural value in ways that prevent one from participating as a peer in social life. I'm not going to read that out, but you can kind of get a sense there of what she's saying. And importantly, Nancy Fraser's conceptualization of social justice helps to shift attention away from individualized blame and from deficit discourses, those discourses of lack, and places needed attention on transforming those educational cultures, practices, and structures which are implicated in the reproduction of exclusions and inequalities. However, as well as looking at the ways that institutionalized cultural value patterns have discriminatory and exclusionary effects, we also need at the same time to address the lived and emotional dimensions of experience of social and cultural inequality. And the ways that students are differentiated and live out those differentiations through practice is embodied, and yet usually perceived as only about innate or natural potential and ability, or lack of potential and ability. The concept of embodied identities, I think, helps to emphasize the workings of power and difference and the ways that these are marked and inscribed on the body, but also the ways that they might be resisted or subverted through what Foucault calls practices of the self. So in order to make sense of these theoretical arguments, I'm going to now share some data from a recent project of mine called Formations of Gender in Higher Education Pedagogies. I'm going to call that GAP for short. The project was funded by the Higher Education Academy in England, and it took a participatory approach to engage students and lecturers in spaces of critical dialogue to think through the complexities of how we might develop inclusive pedagogies. Paulo Freire's principles of dialogue and praxis underpinned the research in order to try to bring together theory and practice. And this was, I think, reinforced by our research team, which was constituted of both researchers and academic developers. And I've put the names of the team up on the slide for your information, as well as information about the methods, because I don't have time to actually go through the methodology today. But importantly, the data that emerged from the GAP project revealed the complex ways that students associated with diversity, difference, and disadvantage have become characterized by dividing practices that name and make visible the other. Such characterizations included a range of deficit disorders, such as lack of confidence. And confidence, I argue, is used as a signifier of the legitimate and normalized student, and is framed as a neutral, decontextualized, and disembodied trait that students from disadvantaged backgrounds lack. However, the politics of recognition and misrecognition that might work on the student to recast them as lacking confidence become hidden. At the same time, the individual becomes the focus of the need for remedial forms of support. And such remedial forms of support are attached to anxieties about the lowering of standards, and increasingly this discourse of the so-called feminization of higher education, and are also detached from the emotional and the embodied processes of exclusion and marginalization. So, for example, the complex processes of decoding the expectations surrounding acceptable forms of pedagogical participation and subjectivity are made invisible. Rather, the student who's associated with disadvantage often reproduces themselves the narrative of lack of self-confidence and is repositioned as the weak, needy, and passive feminized student at the center of derogatory discourses of policy around widening participation. And this is connected to the emotional work of internalizing processes of misrecognition and not belonging. Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence helps uncover the more subtle forms of exclusion at play in educational institutions, the ways that feelings of being an outsider or unworthy in pedagogical spaces are made to appear natural through the legitimization of particular forms of identity. And this student says, sometimes I even feel nauseous, like I want to be sick just to say a sentence. And I'm not a shy person, but I'm just very nervous in these kinds of situations in higher education. And Lynn Raphael Reed and her colleagues argue that shame is a social emotion that is internalized as a feeling of lack of self-worth or a sense of failure. Shaming is deeply connected to such politics of misrecognition, both the fear of being shamed and also the internalization of shame. And Foucault's concept of dividing practices helps to develop such themes of shaming and being shamed in the constitution of student identity. Dividing practices create boundaries which mark difference on the other who is reclassified as non-standard or non-traditional. And the discourse of lack of confidence, which is seen to be resolved through the so-called delivery of study skills and other kinds of remedial provision, detaches the embodied experiences of symbolic violence and marginalization, expressed, for example, in the students' words, as this kind of extreme nervousness and this nausea. And this helps then to manipulate anxieties about higher education becoming too soft. And in the GAP data, such anxieties were repeatedly articulated in terms of these notions of spoon feeding, which was seen as evidence of the dumbing down and the feminization of teaching and learning. And the suggestion that there's some kind of deficit that teachers have to remedy through performing a maternal nurturing role that is deemed as inappropriate in higher education tends to re-legitimate certain forms of pedagogic practice associated with becoming a so-called independent learner. And of course, independence itself has long-standing gender historical connotations. The feminine body constructed as weak, dependent, and passive. The assumption that pedagogy, becoming feminized, operates to reclaim patriarchal forms of authority, knowledge, and practice in universities connected to masculinized notions of autonomy, rationality, competition, and increasingly of excellence. Teaching that is deemed to be feminized and soft is connected as well to anxieties about encouraging passivity in students. However, pedagogical spaces in contemporary higher education are complex, and they're ridden with contradictions that both lecturers and students are compelled to decode and negotiate in the process of staking out a claim as a legitimate subject or person in the context of university. Within neoliberal frameworks, some forms of emotion are elevated. For example, those emotions that might be seen as useful to the development of employability, as in Goleman's words, tools that can be used by subjects in the project of life and career enhancement. The display of caring is a key example of the way some forms of emotion are elevated, but only within the constraints of neoliberal discourses. And this requires the continual working on the self and control over emotions through what might be recognized as appropriate forms of caring practice. Good teachers should teach in ways that demonstrate that they care about their students and their subject, and good students should learn in ways that demonstrate that they care about their learning. So, for example, in this student's account, she makes the point that gender doesn't matter, but the extent to which a person cares about their education does matter. And this point resonates with debates about who has the right to higher education in relation to derogatory discourses of so-called undeserving students from backgrounds associated with disadvantage. Such themes of caring and having passion for learning or not operate as signifiers of difference and not belonging, marking out bodies out of place. Beverly Skaggs points out that the problem of differentiation in contemporary social context is not about distance, it's about proximity. As higher education is becoming increasingly characterized by diversity, the anxiety about the closeness of the other to those deemed to be worthy of higher education participation is expressed through narratives about the contamination or the possibility of contamination of the university by those other bodies who do not know how to act or how to be university students. And pedagogical practices are assumed to have been dumbed down in order to accommodate those different and other students who are deemed to be plagued with a range of deficit disorders, including lack of passion for learning. For example, this student draws on dividing practices to relocate himself amongst those who know how to aim higher, and aim higher has been a very strong discourse and policy in England, the idea that you must learn to aim higher, that students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds have lower, they lack aspiration. It's a very prevalent discourse. So he takes that up, and he wants to demonstrate that he has a passion for learning, but those other students don't. And his account is explicitly classed. So he says 80% of people who come from a lower class, whose parents didn't go to university, might not address learning in general with quite a passion as those who came from middle classes, or those whose parents went to university. So the marking out of difference is central to identity construction and the processes of becoming a certain kind of student in a highly differentiated set of pedagogical spaces. Care and passion for learning and for teaching are drawn on to create the emotional surfaces and boundaries around inclusion and recognition and the marking out of otherness and difference. However, showing the right kinds of care and passion is a delicate balancing act of not showing too much emotion and also distancing from feminized forms of care and passion. So far, I've argued that the shifting landscape of higher education has led to neoliberal forms of regulation of difference and of pedagogical practice and participation. In this final part, I want to explore possibilities for transforming pedagogical spaces outside of the regulatory technologies of neoliberalism. As I said, I'll draw on Paulo Freire's work to find inspiration and ways of reigniting our pedagogical imaginations in order to do this. The gap findings expose that mainstream teaching and learning practices in higher education do very little to challenge exclusionary, misogynistic, classist, and racist imaginaries. Indeed, higher education pedagogies themselves are deeply implicated in the perpetuation of a politics of misrecognition. And in times of austerity, with increasing student fees and profound moves towards the marketization of higher education, students and learners are prone towards risk-averse dispositions in the pedagogical practices and identities that they engage, unwittingly then reinforcing conservative tendencies towards the exclusion and the fear of difference. And one female lecturer explicitly articulates the challenges that are faced by university teachers in addressing difference, where there's this overwhelming intensification of workload, and lecturers themselves are trying so hard to juggle a range of different expectations in showing that they are also of value within their institutions. So in the neoliberal university, where the pace of work is dramatically sped up, and this has merged with austerity measures and cutbacks, the gap data revealed that lecturers often feel overwhelmed by the sheer breadth and range of expectations and commitments that they're faced with on a weekly basis. And in this framework, there's a lack of resources and critical spaces, both material and conceptual, available to support the development of pedagogical practices in higher education. So I want to think about a post-structural reworking of Freirean-inspired pedagogies that might have the potential to open up interventionist spaces for pedagogies that support the development of inclusive spaces in higher education, in which students work in partnership with their teachers as equal participants in the processes of meaning-making within their subject areas. However, such processes, of course, require sophisticated levels of understanding about the working of power and inequality, and also must address the emotional, cultural, subjective, and symbolic dimensions of pedagogical experience, identity, and meaning-making, as well as questions of material redistribution, which is also, of course, very important. Our gap research, which involved Freirean-inspired participatory approaches, provided some temporary spaces for collective, ethical, and dialogic reflexivity. Reflexivity moves us beyond individual reflection of our strengths and weaknesses and areas for further development. Instead, there's a focus on how we are located and positioned and complicit within complex relations of power and the ways that our social identities, values, and orientations shape such practices. It helps us get behind the unspoken, often invisible workings of power, and the ways we are often unwittingly engaged in the politics of misrecognition. This helps us to facilitate deep and critical discussion about the problematic ways that identity formations are always entangled with pedagogical practice that reproduce social and cultural privileges and exclusions. And out of such approaches, we have developed the CPD resource pack, Teaching Inclusively, in which we offer a range of think pieces as conceptual tools to help consider the ways that teaching and learning practices are always intimately connected with subtle processes of exclusion and misrecognition within different pedagogical contexts. Our participants really valued and embraced the rare opportunity to discuss and debate complex pedagogical questions around identity and difference in relation to their everyday and taken for granted assumptions as both students and teachers. However, such spaces and opportunities need to be further developed and sustained, of course. And unfortunately, given the pressures reinforced by neoliberal agendas and the relentless drive for excellence, there are few spaces that enable such critical, reflexive, ethical orientations to pedagogical development. Transformative pedagogies fully reject the notion that some groups of students are unable to engage with those practices and forms of knowledge granted the highest levels of social esteem. Such perspectives are based on flawed assumptions of deficit. Rather, the work of the teacher is to demystify those practices and forms of knowledge in order to make them accessible to those who've been historically excluded from the opportunity to engage them. One of the key aims of developing transformative pedagogies is to value and recognize the richness and diversity of experiences and perspectives that all students bring to their learning and pedagogical relationships. These experiences and perspectives are seen as key resources for processes of collaborative meaning-making, and part of their richness and depth is that they are subjective and contextualized forms of knowledge. Social and cultural differences are drawn on as a way of developing deeper levels of understanding rather than as a problem to be regulated and made to conform to a standard. This is particularly important for those students who feel different or feel that they do not belong in academic spaces, often due to narrow and limited pedagogical frameworks that only value certain forms of knowledge or meaning-making. So it's of great importance that university teachers take seriously the development of safe learning spaces, although I want to problematize the notion of safe, where students are able to explore new and unfamiliar ideas with the constructive support of their peers and teachers, but without the fear of being ridiculed or misrecognized. This involves creating challenging learning spaces in which questioning and critical approaches are encouraged, but also at the same time enabling students to have access to and work through unfamiliar ideas without the fear of making mistakes. And this requires sophisticated levels of understanding on the part of the teacher of complex pedagogical relations and the operation of power in the classroom, which it will be different every time you have a pedagogical encounter. And whether we use face-to-face, social technologies, or a combination of these, we need to develop pedagogical frameworks that create opportunities for exclusive forms of knowledge and practice to become accessible, inclusive, and participatory through processes of redistribution, as well as to subject those to critique and to the possibilities of change and transformation. And through this process, knowledge and practice will, in itself, evolve and transform. And at the same time, those groups who have now become included will contribute to the development of alternative forms of knowledge and practice. And this will open up possibilities for other ways of doing, becoming, teaching, learning, thinking, belonging, and knowing, and so forth. However, it's important to strongly emphasize this is not about lowering of standards. It is not about creating substandard courses or or degrees. Indeed, in my view, it is about strengthening standard and quality, as it requires all participants in higher education to develop deeper levels of criticality and reflexivity, bringing together theory and practice through a commitment to praxis. Praxis being the dialogic relationship between reflection, action, action, reflection. And Paulo Freire talks about such processes in terms of what he calls the circle of knowledge. This is the coming together of two moments of the same circle, the moments of understanding existing knowledge while also producing new knowledge. And Freire's circle of knowledge represents the kind of praxis that is, in my view, necessary for transforming pedagogical spaces. The circle allows resistance to the seductions of standardizing, homogenizing, normalizing, regulating, colonizing, and exclusive regimes of knowing and being known. Instead, the circle engages with cyclical, reflexive, reciprocal, collaborative, and partial spaces of knowing, belonging, and becoming that participation in higher education should involve. The ongoing questioning of the assumptions and values that we bring to our learning, identities, and understanding. But at the center of this circle is a deep commitment to ethical practice in and beyond higher education, which demands that questions of equality, power, and representation are at the fore of any pedagogical project. Thank you very much for your time.